Hi everybody! I wanted to do a slight departure for a tutorial this time, see if you like it. So there's this guy on the internet you probably know of called Kevin Perry, and he does interesting visual effects tricks and puzzles and stuff. And I covered a video of his a while back, and ever since then we've been Twitter followers of each other, and every time he makes a new video, it's so perplexing to people. They send it to me and they ask me about it. And last month was no exception when he did this cool, trippy ball size change thing. People kept tagging me in it and stuff, and I'm not sure why people do that, because he does behind the scenes of his videos, and you can kind of figure it out from what he shows. So I don't think it's that fun for me to explain, but nevertheless, I kept seeing this all over my feed, and I was working on my own episode, and I was behind, and I was stressing out. It was late one night, and I just thought, let me just unwind and do something fun. So I did a little remix of his video by adding a cartoon face to the ball and making it talk. Of course, I didn't invent such a thing, right? It's a meme that people do. So I figured maybe this is worthwhile as sort of a tutorial. At least we can do a little walkthrough of my After Effects project and see what I did, because frankly, I don't even remember. It was really late and I wasn't thinking of what I was doing. Anyway, let's take a look at what I did. The first step was, of course, just bringing in his video and putting it into a comp. And to just make sure that I wouldn't be wasting my time and I would be able to stick the face onto the ball, I had to do all the tracking first. I had to figure out how to do it because the ball is just a white, empty ball with no features, but it is moving around and it's changing size a lot. The most logical thing is to track the fingers because they have some features on them and they are attached to the ball. Let's take a look at the trackers I added. So at first, he's holding it with two fingers. I found like the edge of a nail and some kind of dot on the thumb. And because I had 2 points, I was able to track position, rotation, and scale. And it took me from the beginning of the shot pretty far to the point where his actual magic effect happens and the ball is no longer a marble in his front hand. It's a larger ball in the back. So at this point, the fingers are no longer attached to the ball, but that back hand hasn't yet fully grabbed it, so I kind of had to wait until his fingers here grabbed the ball all the way. And the moment that happened, I switched to a different track on this tip of this finger, because the ball is now bigger and his hand is gripping it very firmly and he's moving in a very deliberate way. I figured I don't need to track the rotation or scale, and I just stuck with this 1 point. At a certain point later, he drops it, and there's nothing I can do while it's falling, but once it was gripped by the original hand again, I switched to a third track, where I tracked 2 fingers once more, which took me all the way to the end. So with that partial tracking data, I applied it to some null layers. So I had one going from the beginning to this point, then there was a gap, then there's the second one, and then there's the third one. And these layers would be able to drive some sort of solid or whatever I would do to put a face. So I created a solid. It was just a square solid, which I put an ellipse mask onto. And then I added a grid just so I could see how it's rotating. I parented it to the null, and it wasn't matching very well because, again, the fingers are not a very reliable thing. They kept distorting and moving. So I added a bunch of manual keyframes, and you could see it wasn't perfect, but I kind of adjusted it to a reasonable extent. And then when it gets to the end of that first track, I split the solid into a separate one, and I think I hand animated this portion all up until it hands it off to that next track, at which point there's another solid, and then once it's falling, I hand animated a separate layer, and then it hands it off to that final track. So I had Frankenstein together this series of solids which seemed like one continuous solid. Finally, I had a track. I knew the face would stick on the ball, so I switched my attention to actually making the face. And this is it. It's not a drawing. I didn't use any drawing tools. I didn't go into Photoshop. This is just a bunch of solids. So for instance, the eye white here. It started out as a white square solid, which I resized and reshaped into what I wanted. Added an ellipse mask to it, and added a stroke effect. And I didn't use the generate stroke effect. Instead, I used the layer style stroke. Because the benefit of that is no matter how it might distort or resize, the stroke is always going to be the same thickness and it's not going to be distorted along with the layer. And then the pupil, of course, is also just another square solid with a mask on it. And because I knew that the eyes were going to do some acting and emoting, I just wanted to make it easier for myself to animate. So it's actually set up so that the pupil doesn't go out of the bounds of the eye. And the way I did that is that there's a hidden copy of the eye white above the pupil. And it's actually serving as a layer, as a alpha track matte. So if I make it a little bit transparent, you could see it's controlling the visibility of the pupil. And when it's sitting on top of the other eye white, it creates that effect. And it's also parented to the eye, so that if the eye resizes or moves anywhere, like if I'm doing a blink, it'll also obscure the pupil. And not only that, but the mask on the matte is actually linked with an expression. It's just pick-whipped linked to this mask shape, so that even if I do something like this kind of distortion, it will follow inside the matte as well and obscure the pupil. So I set that up and I copied the whole thing to the other side. I usually just, you know, this gets created in like in the middle, and then I shift arrow key, nudge it to a certain, you know, place, and however many times I nudged it to one direction, I do the same thing but in the opposite direction with the copy, so that it ends up in the right opposite symmetrical place. The mouth is also another solid with a mask on it, and I used as few points as possible so that the mouth is easy to control with just a few little adjustments. And the eyebrows most likely are also just solids with what was originally an ellipse, which I kind of distorted into this shape. So that's the whole face. It was all set up and ready to be animated. But again, I like to leave the fun stuff for last. So I went in and before animating the face, I just had the static face and I replaced these solids with the face layer. Now you might notice that the face is actually pretty big on the ball compared to the amount of space it takes in this comp, and that's because it's not just flatly pasted on top of the ball, it's actually wrapped around a 3D sphere using the CC sphere effect. So if I turn on this temporary background, you can see when this effect is on, it's actually wrapped around. And that's why I made this comp fairly big for the face, and it's exactly twice as wide as it is tall, because that's how you fully wrap around a sphere. So with everything in place, the final step was the actual creative fun part of animating it, and there was no soundtrack or anything to lip sync to. All I did was just go through, kind of figure out on the fly what the ball might say, how long it might take, and then I'd switch into this face comp and animate one element at a time. So for the mouth, I was just adding a bunch of keyframes to the mask shape. I figured, okay, he's gonna say hello, right? So what are the phonemes in hello? Hello, right? I added those keyframes roughly one after another, and then I kept previewing little sections to see, okay, is he saying it too fast? Is he saying it too slow? Is it happening at the right moment in the context of the video? And I went bit by bit, phrase by phrase, did the mouth, or sometimes I probably did the blinking first or something. I would do one element, go all the way through, do another element, you know, animate the eye movements, animate the eyebrow movements, just kept adding layers of motion. And before I knew it, I had this whole big set of keyframes for the entire face. And I know it might look like a lot, but it took me less than an hour, I'm pretty sure, to throw all these together and finalize the acting of this little ball. So with that completed, I put a few finishing touches out here because I already have the graphic wrapped around a sphere, so this gave me an extra control of actually rotating it around this virtual sphere. So that's how I did the beginning when he actually gets revealed. I just animated those parameters for him to wrap around. And then during some of the parts, I did a little head shaking motions and things like that. And actually, once the face was doing the animation, I realized sometimes the hands would occlude it, and I wasn't about to sit there and rotoscope fingers on top of the face. Even I have limits. So I just animated him in subtle ways to avoid any kind of intersection. You see his mouth get smaller here just for the sake of avoiding this finger. So yeah, that was the whole acting portion of it. I added a motion blur, which I guess is a stylistic choice. Maybe it would have worked without it. So with the core animation done, I just took this entire thing, I threw it into another comp, added my little watermark with his, and there's a happy accident here where, for some reason, with this combination of colors, the darker color mode made my logo go behind his head. I got that for free. And I added the subtitles of what he's saying using the traditional impact font for meme stuff. And by the way, there's a little tip for text with thick strokes if you're doing text in After Effects. A lot of times you'll see stuff like this, where you have these bunched up letters and they all kind of, the subsequent letter obscures the previous letter. And this is a very noob After Effects thing, because that's the default stroke behavior in the text tool, in the character tool. But when you have this kind of situation where things are going to be bunching up against each other, you want to make sure that you switch it to all fills over all strokes, so that you have all of your actual text atop all of the stroke color. Just a little tip there. So that was the end of the work. Instead of sleeping, this is how I unwind, I guess. I waste my time on stupid little things like this, but it's fun. And now, if you want to add a face to something, you have some reference to turn to. And if you have your own techniques for this type of stuff that I haven't covered or that I might want to know, I guess let me know on Patreon. Otherwise, I will talk to you in the next tutorial. Thanks.